Hello, welcome to Chapter 4, the first video of 2, and we're getting into activity-based costing. The main thing with learning about activity-based costing, in this first video we're going to go over 4 learning objectives, and in the second video we're going to go over objective 4.2, which is the main calculation part. Not to say we aren't going to do some calculation today. So if you remember, let's remind ourselves from chapter 3, we learned about job costing, where we had 3 things. We had, well, let me get myself set up here. We had 3 main things. We had direct labor, direct materials, and we had manufacturing overhead. And we said most of our work is going to be calculating manufacturing overhead. That's what this whole thing mainly is about. Direct labor and direct materials we know, or we can find out. We have to estimate manufacturing overhead, and therefore we have different ways of estimating it. If you remember, we had this whole pool of our estimated total manufacturing overhead, and we said, okay, we're going to use an estimate of the total and an estimate of something called a cost driver. And a cost driver was just something else that we could actually track that would allow us to apply the manufacturing overhead. For example, let's use a very simple example. Let's say all you have is one machine. You've got some sort of big machine, a printing press or something like that, and all it uses is electricity. Well, you don't, at the end of the month, you haven't gotten the electricity bill, but you could probably estimate your electricity bill based upon, well, how long did I actually run the printing press? If I ran it 100 hours versus 200 hours, I'd probably have a good guess of what my actual electricity bill would be. And that's the whole point of manufacturing overhead. You don't know what that electricity bill is, so let me use something else that I can measure to give myself an estimate. And later on we'll circle back and then, true it up. We'll say, okay, my bill was a little over, a little under. So in job costing, chapter 3, we decided all of this overhead, all of these indirect items we just use one thing, whether it was direct labor hours or machine hours or whatever it was, we just use one thing. All chapter 4 does is uses this exact same concept. All we're going to do is extend this concept. So if you've learned what you needed to learn in chapter 3, chapter 4 should just be the next step. It's not a new concept. It's just saying, well, most businesses are a little more complex than it just has one big machine. Maybe it has a couple of different departments that do different things. And that's what we see here. We see, okay, perhaps we have a department, a machining department, that maybe our best guess of what runs the cost in that department is machine hours. And then we've got a finishing department. Maybe that's a bunch of hand labor. So we might think about measuring the manufacturing overhead about that. So all we're doing now, different from 3, is 3 would just have one big group of manufacturing overhead, of estimated manufacturing overhead. And here in chapter 4, we're going to say, well, probably more accurate that we need to track it by 2 or more smaller groups of manufacturing overhead. We'll still track direct labor and we'll still track direct materials. Now manufacturing overhead just comes in 2 or more smaller groups rather than one group, which is what the chapter 3 was about. So just keep that in mind as we go through, that we're going to be doing all the same things. And in fact, almost all the questions in this group look at it in this way. They ask, what is the amount if we looked at it under one group, which is chapter 3. So that would be chapter 3 would look at it as one group. Chapter 4 looks at it, well, let's then reevaluate it in 2+ groups. Some of the questions will have 2 groups, some have 3 groups. So that's all we're doing. So you'll see a lot of times we recalculate things and then compare them. What do our costs look like under just one group of manufacturing overhead, and what does it look like under 2 or more groups? So let's just jump right into it. So here they're using an example similar to question 1. They say, okay, Maybe before we had this plant-wide overhead rate, which was based on direct labor hours, and there was a total of 1 million manufacturing overhead. And they're thinking about moving to splitting this up into two groups. They're saying perhaps it would be better if we split it up into a machining department and a finishing department. If you notice, the manufacturing overhead didn't go up. There's still only $1 million in the manufacturing overhead. You're just tracing it differently by different departments. And so if the first main lesson of chapter 4 is to realize we're just doing the same thing as chapter 3, except with 2 or more groups, the second thing you need to remember about chapter 4 is we do this because hopefully it gives us a better idea of costs. Because the main thing about making good manufacturing decisions or good managerial accounting decisions is you want your costs to be accurate. If you estimate your costs too low, well, then you're going to estimate your price too low. And when your bills come in, you're not going to have enough profit to cover it. Conversely, if you estimate too high, you'll charge too high a price. And even though that may sound good, perhaps you'll be pricing yourself out of the market. Perhaps other companies who have better pricing or more accurate pricing can charge a lower price because they actually know what their costs are. So it's neither good to charge too little nor too much, because neither is accurate and will lead to different bad outcomes. So we want to be accurate. We want to have good costs and come in as close as possible. So that's the purpose of this activity-based costing. Recognize that companies are a little bit more complex and may have more than one type of manufacturing overhead, and we want to split it up. We don't want to split it up into 100 different little groups. We want to split it up into just enough groups that gives us a very good, accurate look at our costs. So here, we started off with 1 with direct labor hours for $1 million, and we're thinking about going to 2 and still having these manufacturing overhead. And we have 2 jobs, and we want to basically look at the jobs under the original 1 group rate, the plant-wide rate, and then look at it with the 2 rates. So let's first calculate our plant-wide overhead rate. This is similar. This is exactly what we did in chapter 3. So we would take the total MOH, and this is the 1 million. It's still trying to try to turn that off. And our allocation base here is 20,000. And where am I getting that from? I was going to say I almost spooked myself. I thought I hadn't written it down. It's here in the question. So they're saying figure out the plant-wide overhead rate for using 20,000 of direct actual labor hours. So that would come in at a rate of $50. So if we use this, and it says, okay, figure out this would be one rate we could use, $50. Now it says figure out the same rates, but using the departmental overhead. So departmental uses a slightly different amount, right? We're using 660, and we're using 340. And these, well, we've got machining use machine hours, so this is 15,000, and that comes out to $44 per machine hour. And the next one is 7,000 direct labor hours, and that comes out to 20. So if you notice, when we use just one rate, we're going to estimate things at $50, and it'll be on direct labor. If we use 2 rates, we're going to be using it on machine hours and direct labor hours, and they have a slightly different charge rate per type. Okay, so now that we have these rates, let's go ahead and look at them in the 2 different ways. Okay, let's first allocate the manufacturing overhead according to just the one rate. The plant-wide rate is just the one rate, the one group rate. So we pull down the 50 that we just calculated, and we look at the actual use. Oops. Oh, this is so sensitive. Okay, So our actual use, if we look at here, remember the plant-wide rate is based on direct labor hours. So the total direct labor hours is 7 and 7, right? So we would say, okay, actual use here, and these would be 350 to these two jobs. Now, if we go ahead and say, well, what would the allocation rate be if we used the new rates, the two different departmental rates? Well, you have to look here is this amount of money. Well, what we're going to look at machine hours. Machine hours for job 450. Now, remember the machining department uses machine hours, and that's job 450 is right here, the 3 machine hours. So 3, this would be kind of 3 times 44. Wow, it is. Which would be 132. And for this one, the machining would be 4 times 4. And that would be 176. So all I'm looking at is the machine hours here and the machine hours here for the two different jobs. Now here's a little bit of a tricky part. Finishing. Well, remember, we're not taking the total direct labor hours. Only the finishing department uses labor hours now. So 7 may be the total hours spent on it, but for part of it we're using machine hours, and part of it we're using direct labor. So only the finishing department's hours are we using the direct labor hours. So we're going to use these two. So 6 times 20, well, that's 120, and 6 times 100. So this is going to be cost of 276 and 252. Well, let's just take a quick comparison of these two. So now you're saying on the original system, we would have charged 350 for each. Under this new system, we would have charged 252 and 276. So we may have charged too many costs under the original system, and that would have led to, well, what? We may have ended up having a billing price, a retail price too high. So we're going to say here for both of these, job 450 and 455, they were over costed. And we can figure out the amount. This one looks like 98. This one, well, I'm going to peek. This one's 74. But both of these are over. Now, in your own problem, it may be under. In other words, if this number is higher than what the single allocation rate is, you would say it was undercosted. So this is going to be sort of the plan of attack. We're going to look at things under the single rate, and then we're going to look at things under the multiple department rate and do a compare contrast. That's going to be a lot of what we do. Okay, moving on to the next question. So this is like question number 2. We're given a bunch of information here. Company produces this medication. It has a couple of different products. So we're going to look at, well, you can see here, we don't have just 1 or 2 different categories. We have 3 categories. And each category will have its own thing. So you say this one is done according to kilos, this one is machine hours, and this is according to samples. Now you notice here we don't have anything to do with direct labor. So each time we have a different new category, we can have different types of ways we measure it. So here we have the total indirect cost. This is sort of our total overhead. Well, rather than making me write these in because they were given just in the not in the example, in the table above, I've kind of already typed them in. But here we're saying, okay, well, let's just go through and figure out what's the allocation rate per each. So this one is, well, this is going to say for material handling, we're going to add an additional $10 in indirect costs or overhead per kilogram, and so on and so forth. We can go through and look at each of these, and what we're doing is we're figuring out an allocation rate for each category, each of these departments, each of these smaller groups. Okay, so what is going to be, so we're going to use these rates that we just found to compute the indirect costs. So this is pulling down, these couple of charts are just pulling down what we have seen before. So we had all of this information from the problem. This is what we just figured out in the last section, and now we're just going to apply them. So if I was to say material handling, now notice material handling is per kilogram, right? And kilograms, well, for the different, so we'll just say commercial container and travel pack. It's a little bit off the screen. So material handling is $10 per kilogram, and there's 8,000 kilos. So 10 times 8,000, well, that's going to be 80,000. 10 times 6,000, well, that's going to be 60,000. And so on and so forth. Just remember that material handling is according to kgs, kilograms. Packaging is according to machine hour. Q&A is according to samples. And so in other words, you just want to make sure you match up the right allocation rate, the right rate to the right amount. So we work through this and we find out this is 240,000 multiplying 200 times 1,200. This one is 80,000. This one is 10,000. And this will be the three main categories, right? And we can come up with a total indirect costs, and that's going to be 330. And this is going to be 155. Now, a question you might get is, okay, that may be the total costs, but we sell a whole lot, maybe we sell a whole lot more travel packs than we do commercial containers. What is the per unit cost? Well, here we were given how many units we actually produced. 2,500 and 50,000. So we would say this one, put those in there. What was that, 50,000? And we would just do a divide. Divide one by the other. And we'd come out and we'd say, well, the commercial pack has $132 in costs. And this one only has $3.10. So the travel packs are smaller. Looking at just at the numbers up above, you might not realize it until you actually see what's the amount produced. So we might want to ask ourselves a couple of questions about these per unit costs and whatnot. So we would say, okay, we figured out the allocation based upon the three categories, right? We looked at material handling, packaging, and quality assurance. And now we're going to look at it under the single allocation. Remember, I said a lot of what we do is in this chapter is saying, what does it look like under the single group? What does it look like under the multiple group analysis? So here, if you remember, we are given $300 per machine hour. So they're saying, assume that the original single allocation rate was 300. So we'd say, okay, 300 here. And I've reminded ourselves of some of the information that was given to us before. So if it's direct per machine hour, well, we have machine hour here, 1,200 for the commercial container, and 400 for the travel pack. So just remember, oops, there's units. The cost, we just multiply that out. This will be 360,000. And perhaps you can see where we're going. We're trying to get, and we still have these same units. We're trying to see if we use just this generic one rate, what would we have as far as a per unit cost? 144, and this would come out to 240. If we just take a look back here, where we came up with 132 and 310, well, they don't seem very far off. But imagine you're trying to charge something for this. You think your costs are $2.40, so maybe you only charge $4, right? But you find out later that your costs are actually $3.10. Well, the difference between those two amounts of profit is pretty big, and you're making that on 50,000. So they may not seem very big, but you create your retail price based upon your costs. And if you're a little bit off, and that's actually, you know, I don't know what the percentage is, but that's a pretty, you know, that's 70 cents difference off of $2.40. So that's a little more than a third. So if you're that far off, if you're 40% off, let's say it's around 40% off, then your price is going to not be high enough to cover the amount of profit that you need to. Look at all those little marks. So the last part of that question is they're going to ask you, well, let's think about it. What does that really mean? What are we looking at and what have we learned? And it says compare the activity-based costs. It's kind of bugging me, actually. Compare the activity-based costs to the single types of cost. And what do we learn? Well, we learned that the original system, just using the 300, overcosted the commercial containers and undercosted the travel packs. And that has implications for how much we charge in our price. So just realize that the single allocation a lot of times gives you an inaccurate. It doesn't apply the costs in the proper way. Okay, so those were the two kind of more calculation focused on this. The other couple of problems that we have here are more general knowledge and concepts. So I'm going to direct you to the book and make sure you read these sections and understand the concepts, but I'll just kind of fill in a little bit and show you a little bit of what they're trying to ask. So when we talk about lean operations, typically what they mean for lean operations is an operations where you don't have much inventory. And if you don't have much inventory, you don't have much waste. So you're very good at estimating and accurately moving product through the system in response to demand. A lot of times, it used to be in the past, you'd say, just build a whole bunch and put the rest in storage because you might have economies of scale. But you'd find out after a certain while that those products go bad, or they become out of date, or they become unfashionable. And so the best way over time people have found is kind of be lean, meaning you need a little bit of product. Okay, we'll make a little bit of product and then we'll process it and move it on. And so like Toyota Manufacturing System did that. They worked very closely with their suppliers and said, throughout the day, I don't want you to deliver once a week, you know, a big load of car doors. I want you to deliver five car doors per hour so that I can put them on the cars as I'm making them. I don't want any extra inventory, because if you think about it, inventory, you had to pay for inventory. So any inventory sitting there is money that's not being used. It could be going to other purposes. So think about lean operations in that way. It's lower inventory, it's faster turnaround time, and it is a little bit better organized. So here we can look at a couple of example questions that are from the actual question. Manufacturing plants tend to be organized with self-contained production cells. Well, that's a lean, just meaning that they're not super reliable on other parts of the production cycle. They manage themselves very well. Here, maintain greater quantities of raw materials. Well, that's I was saying was more traditional. In other words, just stockpiling these big inventories. Well, that's just dead money. That's just money just sitting there not really doing anything for you. So if you're good enough, you can work with your suppliers and get a little delivery, make a little product, deliver a little bit of product yourself, and then turn around and do it all over again. Setup times are longer. Well, that's in lean manufacturing, you want to be kind of nimble and accurate. So if you're making small batches, you're going to have some turnover time, and you're going to get really good at saying, okay, we're making red cars, and now we're going to make blue cars, and now we're going to make minivans in small batches. So you've learned to develop to have a quick turnaround time on changing your machines out and your setup times. So here, the longer ones, that's traditional. Shorter ones would be the lean. High quality is stressed in every aspect, and we'll look a little bit in the next question on quality. So the idea is, anytime you make a mistake in the manufacturing process, well, that just means more waste time, because you've got to then send that product back through the process, or you have to have someone work on it. So anytime you have less than a very high quality means that you're having some sort of waste, and waste is money down the drain. So high quality is stressed as part of lean or good quality manufacturing. It's not always called lean, they have some other names. And in fact, learning objective 4.5 actually goes into a bunch of these other names, and you should look at these. You should look at the examples in the book or the explanations in the book, because these are going to be the ones that'll help you. The book will help you understand all of these, but they are kind of divided into two major categories. One is kind of the Toyota manufacturing, lean manufacturing idea, and you'll see some words here like Kaizen, takt time, and whatnot that are kind of from the Toyota manufacturing system. That's where the Americans learned about this. So Kaizen and whatnot. And that's all of this, like I said, good, fast turnaround, small batches, very accurate in predicting your needs. And the other thing is just what I was talking about before, reducing the waste. In other words, things that, for example, it used to be, like General Motors they'd have a lot of, they thought just producing in big batches, and if we've got a bunch of cars that had problems, we'll just fix them at the end of the production line. Well, that led to where they'd have these big parking lots of cars that they'd have to fix. So those are cars that are made but can't be sold, and do you get around to them? And if you don't get around them in time, maybe the season turns over and you can't sell them for as high a price. So anytime you have any sort of waste, then or low quality, then that's going to be wasting money. And that's what these kind of are divided up into. And I've kind of pointed out a few here. So cycle time, well, that's what I was talking about. You want to have a quick manufacturing cycle time from when you begin to the end and move things in a quicker cycle. There's an acronym for waste, downtime, defects, overproduction, producing more than you have. Well, that just means extra inventory. Waiting. If one person in this production chain is waiting on another process, well, they're not producing anything, and therefore you're paying them. They're not being as high value as you can, and so that's a waste. So there's all the letters downtime have something. Kaizen, that was just a way to, that was kind of their calling word for let's improve the manufacturing process. And there's a famous book, if you ever get into supply chain management, called The Goal, which is written kind of in, I think it was probably the 80s when the Japanese manufacturers were doing so much better than the auto manufacturers, doing so much better than the U.S. manufacturers. The Japanese auto manufacturers doing better than the U.S. manufacturers. And this guy wrote something to kind of explain in kind of a novel form. It was actually like following a fictitious guy going through and figuring out his own manufacturing environment, what was going right and what was going wrong. It's a pretty good read. And here's just another example of another Japanese phrase, the takt time. It just means what is the timing from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. Internal failure costs. Well, there's internal and external, but these are the ones if you have to have some, you want these. You want the internal ones. Ones that are low quality. You find low quality goods within your process, but before you deliver them to the customer, you're still wasting money there, but at least with external failures, those are the ones that the customers find out and return to you. Well, you lose brand recognition and you have to return those things. So those are really bad costs. So any failure costs are bad, but internal failures, that's where you'd like to find it rather than having your customer come tell you, oh, this thing failed. Okay, so that is the 4 learning objectives for this session. We'll finish up with just going through learning objective 4.2, which is, again, just more of a calculation-heavy learning objective where we actually do something what we did just before. What does this problem look like under 1 job costing allocation, manufacturing overhead group, and what does it look like under 2 or more? Okay, as usual, please email me your questions or come see me during my office hours as listed on Blackboard. Thank you.